In 1998, a hiker in Gadsden, Alabama, ventured into the serene trails of Noccalula Falls. The trails were familiar, peaceful, and untouched until that evening. What started as a casual hike turned into an encounter with something unexplainable. What followed him home was more terrifying than he could have imagined. It was July 12th, 1998. I remember the date because it was the day before my birthday. I had just turned 35, single, and still living in Gadsden, Alabama. The kind of small-town life where everyone knows everyone, or at least thinks they do. My name is Derek. I wasn't in the best shape of my life, but I'd taken to hiking Noccalula Falls in the evenings to clear my head and get in some exercise. It was peaceful up there usually. That evening, I decided to push myself and hike a little further than I normally did. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow over the trees. The trail was empty, or so I thought. I always liked it better that way, just me and the sounds of nature. About halfway up, I heard it, a whistle. At first, I didn't think much of it, maybe another hiker further up the trail. But it wasn't the kind of cheerful whistle someone makes when they're happy. It was slow, deliberate, and repetitive. A tune I didn't recognize, but one that felt old. I kept walking. The sound stayed behind me, always at the same distance. I'd stopped to catch my breath, and it had stopped too. I'd start walking again, and there it was. It felt like someone was keeping pace with me, staying just far enough out of sight to remain unseen. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed through the trees, but there was no response. I told myself it was probably just some kid messing around. That thought kept me moving, even though the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. By the time I reached the summit, the whistling had stopped. The view up there was stunning, as always, the kind of beauty that almost makes you forget how unsettled you are. Almost. I stayed just long enough to catch my breath before heading back down. The sun was gone now, and the trail was darker than I'd like. I'd forgotten my flashlight at home, so I picked up the pace. That's when I noticed the whistling again. This time, it was closer. Much closer. It didn't sound like it was behind me anymore. It sounded like it was all around me, bouncing off the trees. I broke into a jog, then a full sprint. The sound followed, staying just out of sight but never fading. When I got to the parking lot, I froze. My car, a beat-up old Toyota, was covered in scratches. Deep, jagged lines that ran from the hood to the trunk. It looked like someone had gone at it with a knife or some kind of claw. My heart was racing, but I didn't see anyone around. I jumped in the car, locked the doors, and sped out of there. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that damn whistling. It was faint, like it was coming from somewhere far off, but it was there. I kept telling myself it was in my head, just some trick my brain was playing on me after a stressful evening. But I didn't believe it. A few days later, I came home from work to find my landlord standing outside my apartment. Mr. Dunbar was an older guy, usually friendly, but he looked pale and shaken. "Derek," he said, "I don't know what kind of trouble you're mixed up in, but you've got to fix this." "What are you talking about?" I asked. He pointed to my apartment door. It was covered in scratches, just like my car had been. Deep, jagged marks that looked like they'd been made by something with claws. I didn't know what to say. I hadn't told anyone about what happened on my hike that night. That night, the whistling came back, louder this time. I tried turning on the TV. cranking the volume to drown it out, but it didn't help. The sound was inside my head, and no amount of noise could push it out. I barely slept, jumping at every little sound, convinced someone was outside my window. I decided to move. Gadsden was too small, and whatever was happening wasn't going to stop if I stayed. I found a place in Birmingham, a 2-hour drive away. Bigger city, more people, more noise. I thought I'd be safe there. For a while, I was. I settled into my new routine, started hiking new trails, and tried to forget about that night. But it didn't last. About 2 months after I moved, I found scratches on my new apartment door again. The same deep, jagged lines. And that night, the whistling came back. Faint at first, but it grew louder as the hours dragged on. I couldn't escape it. No matter where I went, it followed. I tried staying with friends, even checked into a motel for a week, but the scratches and the whistling always found me. One night, I decided to confront it. Don't ask me what drove me to such stupidness. I was done running, I guess. I drove back to Noccalula Falls, parked my car, and waited. It was late, maybe 10 p.m., and the trail was empty. I sat there in the dark, listening, and sure enough, the whistling started. It came from the trailhead, faint but growing louder. I grabbed a flashlight and got out of the car. My hands were shaking, but I needed to know what was happening. I followed the sound up the trail, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The whistling stayed just ahead of me, leading me further up the trail. It was the same tune as before, slow and deliberate. When I reached the summit, I stopped. The sound was gone. The air was still, and the forest was silent. Too silent. That's when I saw it. A figure. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the moonlight. It was tall and thin, with long limbs that didn't look quite human. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. I froze. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. Then it tilted its head, just slightly, and began to whistle. The same haunting tune I'd been hearing for weeks. My legs finally obeyed, and I bolted down the trail, nearly tripping over roots and rocks in my haste. When I reached the parking lot, my car was gone. In its place was a set of deep claw marks gouged into the asphalt. I didn't stop running until I reached the main road, where I flagged down a passing car. The driver, an older man, looked at me like I was crazy, but he gave me a ride back into town anyway. I never went back to Noccalula Falls. I sold what little I had, quit my job, and moved across the country to Oregon. It's been years now, and the whistling has stopped. But every so often, when I'm out in the woods or walking alone at night, I think I hear it. Just a faint, distant tune carried on the wind. Who knows? Maybe this isn't the last time it comes to visit me. Stay safe out there. You never know what lurks in the darkness.